with the Black family and the Black community. If you remember Daniel Moynihan is the one who wrote the Moynihan Report. And this is his words. He says, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And that's important because a lot of time when people are presented with facts, they stick to what they believe or what they or their opinion or what they've heard other people say and regurgitated. But facts don't care about your opinion. Facts don't care about your feeling. Facts are facts. So your opinion is irrelevant when it comes to facts. That needs to be laid there before we get into the truth of what happened. Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. Is it an opinion that Black women destroy Black families, or is it a fact? We're going to get into that. To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to always remain a child. It is very, okay, for what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history? What I am doing here in these presentations is presenting records from history. Those who keep regurgitating this narrative without actually going back and looking at the records of history are still children. They're remaining childish because they refuse to go research history. And when they're presented with facts, they still deny it. They choose their opinion over fact. So, what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history? We are going to be looking at the records of history in these presentations. Not my opinion, not someone else's opinion. My opinion is relevant. So is everyone else's. Only thing relevant is the truth. Moynihan Report. We all know about the Moynihan Report. Very popular report. Some men have used this to say that the Moynihan Report supports the fallacy that Black women destroy Black families. But who is the person that wrote the Moynihan Report? Let's examine him for a second. This is Daniel Moynihan. He's the one who wrote the Moynihan Report. A little bit about him. He was from New York. He left college teaching to address a larger public audience as an elected official, following a varied career as a social scientist. So he was a social scientist, a presidential aide, an ambassador. Moynihan came to the Senate in 1976 and served 24 years. He was a skilled legislator. He excelled at both floor debate and committee negotiation. He was a New York Democrat. He promoted policies to aid families and to provide stricter child support enforcement. So he actually, and this is relevant because Moynihan wrote the Moynihan Report. And in his report, he mentioned Black women getting assistance. And him rallying for a stricter child support enforcement was most likely based on the history of what a lot of women were dealing with at the time. And so he's very relevant to that conversation as well. And he worked with a Republican Senator Robert Dole to author legislation to stabilize Social Security. He retired in 2001. So, where did Moynihan get his information from for his Moynihan Report that was published? Oh, wait, what was the motive behind the Moynihan Report? So, I believe his motive was, his intentions were pure in a sense. He wrote the report on his own initiative, probably after researching the documents that I'm going to be showing in this presentation. But what he was trying to do was get White House officials to see that civil rights legislation alone would not produce racial equality. So he wanted them to do more for Black people. And so the Moynihan Report was co-written by Richard Goodwin. So something that they were saying, no, wait, President Lyndon Johnson, at the time, after I guess his interaction with Moynihan, declared freedom is not enough. Equal citizenship for African Americans was incomplete without the ability to make a decent living. So I would say Moynihan's motive was pure. And he was trying to shed light on what was needed to help Black people. But where did he get his information? This guy. This guy's name is Franklin Frazier. And if you don't know about Franklin Frazier wrote a book called The Negro Family in the United States. So a little bit about Franklin Frazier. He was born September 24th. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland. He was one of 5 children. That's kind of irrelevant. Okay, so he attended Baltimore public schools before attending classes at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He graduated with honors from Howard in 1916. So he was very smart. And interesting thing about that date, 1916. In 1916, a book that that's in this slide as well. The book was called Broken Homes. That book was published in 1916, and it documented how women were being abandoned, and it was trying to get social workers to kind of deal with the epidemic of men abandoning their wives and children. And so he graduated when that book was published. So he began his career teaching mathematics at Tuskegee. We all know about Tuskegee. I'm assuming he taught English and history at St. Paul's Normal and Industrial School in Lawrenceville, Virginia. And French and mathematics at Baltimore High School. So he was a very skilled man. Like, he sounds like he was very smart. He was very intelligent. He attended Clark Universities, where he earned his master's degree. And the topic of his thesis was New Currents of Thought Among the Colored People of America. So Franklin Frazier had a doctorate in sociology. So Patrick Moynihan was a social scientist. Moynihan was a sociologist. Not Moynihan. Franklin Frazier was a sociologist. He had a doctorate. So we know sociologists, they study behaviors and patterns and things like that. So this was the book that Franklin Frazier wrote. It was originally published. When was this book originally published? I think it was 1939. This book was originally published. But this is Franklin Frazier's book, The Negro Family in the United States. Originally, when he wrote this was just for his college dissertation for his master's degree. But it was so good and informative that they made it into a book and published it. So this was his book. Now, what really caused the destruction of Black families according to Frazier's research? And this is in his book, The Negro Family in the United States. Number 1, slavery. Number 2, he said freedom, which is interesting. Number 3, he mentioned desertion on part of the men, not the women, desertion on part of the men. And number 4, urbanization of the Negro population, or city life. So one of the things the number 1 thing he listed was slavery. We all know slavery destroyed Black families. It's self-explanatory. Children were sold apart from their mothers. Husbands were sold apart from their wives. And they separated families by selling them to different slave masters who would go to different states or parts of the city. So they would see their families. The last time a lot of the slaves saw their family was on the auction block, and then they were sold and they never saw them again. That was the number 1 reason, or the number 1 thing that caused the destruction of the Black families. But then Fraser says freedom helped destroy Black families also. How did freedom help destroy Black families? According to Fraser, something happened when Black men were set free, but it didn't happen with every single Black man. My question, when the men are given freedom and all the restraints that are forcing them to do something that they really don't want to do are removed, do they usually choose to do the right things or the wrong things? Do they just go wild and do what they want, or do they practice self-control? Do they put themselves and their interests first, or do they make the sacrifice for their families or others the same way that women are expected to make sacrifices? So this was from his book. This chapter is called Broken Bonds. This is from Fraser's book, The Negro Family in the United States, and I'm only going to be reading the highlighted parts. How did the Negro family fare when it left the house of the master and began its independent career in the stormy days of emancipation? What authority was there to take the place of the masters in regulating sex relations and maintaining the permanency of marital ties? In the absence of family traditions and public opinion, what restraint was there upon individual impulse unleashed in those disordered times? Emancipation was a crisis in the life of the Negro that tended to destroy all his traditional ways of thinking and acting. So one thing that I like about Fraser's book is that he puts sources that you could actually go research or study for yourself. So this is actually, I mean, that's what you learn in college. When you quote someone or you use information, you put the source and give them credit. So this is one source. But anyway, let's continue. Okay. I'm just reading highlighted parts. When the bonds of sympathy and affection between the members of these families were strong enough to remain unbroken after emancipation, the subsequent struggle for existence during those trying times tended to strengthen family ties. The first problem which the freedmen faced was that of finding food and shelter. Du Bois writes. So we all know who Webb Du Bois is. So I'm just reading the highlighted parts again. The success which attended the Negro's first efforts to get established as a free man depended, of course, to a large extent upon his character, intelligence, and efficiency, which in turn reflected his schooling during slavery. We are able to see how the freedmen got started in the following description of a freedman who, although he still retained a second wife on another plantation, settled down with his family, and through his enterprise and intelligence, succeeded in establishing himself as a free man. And I think I'm going to try to look for this book by Webb Du Bois. The book is called The Negro Landholder of Georgia. Yeah. Anyway, let's continue. So, the transition from slavery to freedom was made with little interruption of the habits acquired during slavery. The schooling which the father had received as a responsible person on the plantation enabled him to assume the responsibilities and duties of a free man. Two general tendencies are manifest in the fortunes of the Negro family during the period of its adjustment to the state of freedom. So Fraser is going to talk about what happened. He's going to talk about how freedom contributed to the destruction of Black families. So he's going to talk about the two things that happened. So first, following the collapse of the slave regime, the families that had achieved a fair degree of organization during slavery made the transition without much disturbance to the routine of living. In these families, the authority of the father was firmly established, and the woman in the role of mother and wife fitted into the pattern of the patriarchal household. Moreover, in assuming the responsibilities of his new status, the father became the chief, if not sole, breadwinner. So you had some Black men who adapted, they stepped into traditional roles as men and they provided. That allowed the woman, the wife, to be able to step into her role as wife and mother. And so she was able to operate in a traditional role as a woman because the man was operating in a traditional role as a man. Second thing that happened. Second, the loose ties that had held men and women together in a nominal marriage relation during slavery broke easily during the crisis of emancipation. When this happened, the men cut themselves loose from all family ties and joined the great body of homeless men wandering about the country in search of work and new experience. I was going to say homosexuals instead of homeless men, but this sounds just like homosexuals wandering about, looking in search of work and new experience, sleeping on couch to couch, not really doing much with his life, but trying to search out new experiences. So the reality of the situation is this. In regards to Black families, historically, some Black men stayed and took care of their families, and other Black men created broken homes by running off on their wives and children as early as 1863. So broken homes did not start in the 60s. Broken homes first started with slavery, but after the men were free, they also created broken homes because they ran off and left the women and children. Another thing Franklin Frazier talks about in his book, The Negro Family in the United States, is the men deserting the women. He says desertion on part of the men, not women, men. So, what is desertion? Desertion is the act of leaving someone behind in a difficult situation. It's also willful abandonment of a person's duties or obligations, especially to a spouse or a child. So desertion is simply what we see in 2023. The men running off, leaving the women with children to raise on their own. That's what desertion is. And that's what contributed to the destruction of Black families as early as 1863. Or is it 83? Let me see. Yeah, 1863. Anyway, I'm going to read some more. This is still Franklin Frazier's book, The Negro Family in the United States. And this is from a book, I'm at the chapter entitled Fathers on Leave. Pay really close attention to what he's saying in his book. Okay. I'm just reading the highlighted part. Now, everyone, you probably need to take a deep breath so that you can process all of this. Because when I read these things and I learned what was really happening, I was very sad and disappointed. So take a deep breath. Okay. In both northern and southern cities, the ranks of Negro men who have deserted their families have constantly been recruited from several sources. So this isn't opinion. There's actual sources to back up what Franklin Frazier is saying and what other people have said. Among the footloose men, or we should say homosexuals, who drift from city to city in search of work and new experience, there are husbands and fathers who have deserted their wives and children. Let's read that again. Among the homosexual men who drift from city to city in search of work and new experience, there are husbands and fathers who have deserted, that means abandoned, their wives and children. Okay. Although it is difficult to get a measure of the extent to which Negro men desert or abandon their wives and families, it appears from available sources of information that desertions or abandonment are more frequent in Negro families than in the families of other racial groups. Now, this is a Black man. This is a Black sociologist who studies behavior and patterns in communities. This is a Black male sociologist with a doctorate degree saying this. Let's read it again. Although it is difficult to get a measure of the extent to which Negro men desert or abandon their wives and families, it appears from available sources of information that desertions or abandonments are more frequent in Negro families than in the families of other racial groups. And can we not look at the world and see that? Anyway, for example, while Negroes comprised 5.6% of all the families in New York City in 1916 through 1917, under the care of the charity organization Society, they furnished 11.2% of the desertions. Now, another source he lists is this book. I have this book too, Broken Homes. And this book was published in 1919, actually. I stand corrected. I said 1916, but it was 1919, like a few years after Frazier graduated from college. So what is the Charity Organization Society? So basically, the Charity Organization Society was basically a form of welfare. It was it was like people that came together to help women who had been abandoned to raise children alone. These women would go there, they would get help with different things. So I'm just going to read this, okay? The Charity Organization Societies, also called the Associated Charities, was a private charity that existed in the late 1800s and early 1900s as a clearinghouse for information on the poor. The society was mainly concerned with distinction between the deserving poor and undeserving poor. The society believed that giving out charity without investigating the problems behind poverty created a class of citizens that would always be dependent on almsgiving. Okay. So, let's read down here. It says the Charity Organization Society set up centralized records and administrative services and emphasized objective investigations and professional training. So, these people kept records of everything that was happening. And so you could go to these organizations and find data and information on women who were being abandoned to raise children alone. So they were just like welfare. They were helping families, they were helping poor people, they were helping women who were abandoned to raise children alone. So we're going to read more from Frazier's book. This chapter is entitled Fathers on Leave. I need to get this book, A Study of Family Desertions. Anyway, okay, I'm just reading the highlighted part. So, Negroes comprise 21.1% of all desertion cases aided by the county agent. Oh, my bad. From 1909 to 1915, Negroes comprise 21.1% of all desertion cases aided by the county agent. Moreover, the common narrative is that Black women destroyed families in the 60s, but according to the records of history, these women were being abandoned since 1863. And there's actual records of this. But anyway, from 1909 to 1950. So you mean to tell me we've been here in 1960, Black women destroyed families, but the records are showing that someone did break up Black families, but it wasn't Black women. And this book actually points to who destroyed Black families, because it says you can't even count. It's difficult to get a context to the extent that Negro men, aka Black men, abandon their families. But abandonment, men running off and leaving their wives and children, is more common in Black families. Anyway, let's continue. Negroes comprise 21% of all desertion cases aided by the county agent. Moreover, the larger proportion of urban Negro families with women heads seems to be the result in some measure of desertions. Okay, listen very clearly. Of desertions on the part of the men. Let's read that again. The large proportion of urban Negro families with women heads seems to be the result in some measure of desertions on the part of the men. It hardly seems likely that widowhood, divorce, and legal separation alone account for the large percentage of such families in the Negro group. Within the Negro group itself, the proportion of families with female heads is higher among tenants than owners. Especially in the larger cities where the bulk of the Negro population in the North is concentrated. In the 23 southern cities with a population of 100,000 or more in 1930, not 1960, in 1930, from a fifth to a third of all Negro families had a female head. Okay, in regard to the marital status of the women heads of Negro families in these cities, information from the original census returns gives a more accurate picture than one gets from the published data on the marital status of Negro women. The majority of these women, from 2/3 to 4/5, were classified as widowed. From what is known concerning the marital status of Negro women who describe themselves as widowed, we can only assume, as in the case of the published census figures, that some of these widowed women had either been deserted or were unmarried mothers. So basically what they're saying is a lot of women who probably were abandoned were just saying, oh, he died. And that's like normal. Like, even when you go through a breakup, it's like, you're dead to me. So a lot of these women were just saying, oh, he abandoned me. He left me to do everything on my own. He's dead. Okay, so in some cases, as many as 20% of the women heads of families were separated. In all likelihood, the majority of these women had been deserted, i.e., abandoned by their husbands. It is also probable that some of the women who were living irregularly with men but reported themselves as married to other men had been deserted. In fact, it is also very likely that some women who called themselves divorced had been deserted. When these various facts are considered, it seems reasonable to conclude that, so far as these figures are representative of Negro families in southern cities, about a fifth of the families with women heads represents desertion on the part of men, not women. Let's read that again. About a fifth of the families with women heads represent desertion on the part of men. But we're hearing Black women destroy Black families in the 60s. Professionals who have done the research said, no, this was happening as early as 1863. I think I would trust educated professionals more than I would trust someone who most likely can't read above an 8th grade level. Okay, for Birmingham, we have information on the extent of desertion among cases handled by the Red Cross Family Service for the period of 1925 through 1929. So it didn't say 1960s. And the Red Cross, if we know anything about the Red Cross, they are also like an assistance-based company. They help people in need. So historically, Black women were getting assistance as early as 1909, not 1960, like people continue to lie and say. So, let me skip that. For the years 1926 through 1928, about 20% of the colored cases were deserted or abandoned women. The following excerpt from the case record of a deserted/abandoned woman, 28 years of age and the mother of 5 children. Yikes. Living in a 2-room house in an alley for which she paid $8 a month will throw some light on the character of some of these deserted/abandoned women and their sexual relations. So I'm just reading the highlighted part, but if you want to read the whole thing, just pause the video and read it for yourself. Or you can try to find a book. It's a very rare book to come by. It'll probably cost you a couple $100, but if it's worth it to you, you can buy it. So man and woman lived together, very agreeable for a while. He provided very well for his family during their stay together. They were the parents of 3 children, and he deserted when the last one was a few months old, leaving her with nothing to live on. He left town with another man's husband. This sounds like something that I'm reading from 2023. So when men are with the mothers of their children, some of them, they provide. But then once they break up, all of a sudden, they don't want anything to do with the child because they're not involved with the mother. And this guy, he knocked her up 3 times. When their last child together was a few months old, he abandoned her. He left her with nothing to live on. That's the most evil act that you can do to a woman who has given birth to your children. He did not care how she was going to survive. He left her with nothing. What choice did she have but to go to someone else to get help with 3 children? Okay. So this is let us glance at the record of a 24-year-old woman living on the outskirts of Birmingham. So how many children did this woman have? I don't know. Okay. I'm not sure how many children this woman had, but she was 24 years old. Okay, woman allowed a man to live with her in open cohabitation. He knew she had no divorce. Okay, so she was a married woman who had been deserted as well. He promised to marry her all the time. So he was feeding her empty promises like a lot of these guys do. Once child was born to them in 1927, all of a sudden, those promises mean nothing. More than likely, he told her, well, you shouldn't have believed me. But it says he was a carpenter. He has now deserted her and the children, and she is 9 months pregnant. So he he abandoned this woman who was 9 months pregnant with his child. How cold and heartless do you have to be to abandon a woman who is pregnant with your child? And a lot of these women, even back then, They just believed what these men were telling them, just like women today do. We believe, well, I don't anymore, but a lot of women believe what these men tell them, and then a man knocks them up to derail her life, and then once he knows she's going to keep the baby, he runs off and abandons her. This has been happening since 1863. This is not just that's the man you're choosing. No, this is a Black people thing. It's a Black people thing for the men to run off and abandon their children, especially if they're not involved with the mother anymore. All their feelings and love for their children go away. Okay, when we turn from these southern cities to New York City, we find that there also desertion cases constitute a large proportion of the case dependency handled by social agencies. So from the south to the north, to the east to the west, it was the same thing. Black families were dealing with this mostly. The men running off, leaving the women to fend for themselves with their own children. These women had no choice but to get assistance. An analysis of the records of the Charity Organization Society over a period of 10 years from 1924 to 1934 showed that both the number and the proportion of Negro undercare families served by this agency have increased as the economic crisis deepened. So, of course, if you're a woman and you got like 5, 6, 3 kids and you're young and the man abandons you, and then there's like an economic depression, of course more women are going to get assistance, get help, because they can't do everything on their own. In the area for which we have figures, the number of Negro undercare cases increased during the 4 years from 1924 to 1928. Although their numbers relative to all families receiving such assistance changed only slightly. However, beginning with the fiscal year 1928 to 1929, there was not only an increase in the number of Negro families, but also a decided increase in the proportion in the total number of families receiving major services. From 1931 onward, Negro families constituted close to 45% of the total. Wow. So let me read that again. From 1931 onward, Negro families constituted close to 45% of the total families who were getting assistance. So let me just emphasize this. People are saying that Black women destroy Black families because they got welfare and government assistance in 1960. But the records show that, one, Black men have been running off, abandoning their wives and children since 1863. 2, Black women were getting assistance because they were being abandoned as early as 1909. Now you have this saying that from 1931 onward, Negro families constituted close to 45% of the total families that were getting assistance. So somebody lied, and I don't think it's the historical records that are lying. Again, the truth doesn't care about your feelings. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And the facts are saying that men running off and abandoning their children is something that's very common among Black people. And the ones doing the running off are the men, historically. So during the fiscal year 1928 through 1929, the Charity Organization Society gave assistance to 571 Negro undercare families in the Harlem community. So that's literally 1 year, within a year. So, okay, it says after the economic crisis became more acute, the number rose to 1,547 during the fiscal year 1930 through 1931. Okay. So this is history is saying that Black families were being destroyed by the decisions of the men who chose to desert their families. Okay, let's read this. I'm just checking my phone. Okay. From 1921 to 1927, the number of Negro desertion or non-support cases that came before the Court of Domestic Relations increased, almost 100%